Today we're doing something a little different. We're going to open up the Quran, but not just as a sacred text. We're going to look at it as a historical document. Using the tools of textual analysis, we're going to investigate its origins from the inside out and see what clues might be hidden inside its verses.
So, the traditional story is pretty well known, that the Quran is the perfect, unaltered word of God, revealed directly to one man, the Prophet Muhammad. This idea that the text we have today is an exact copy, perfectly preserved, is the starting point for our investigation. But what if that's not the whole picture?
And that's really the big question, isn't it? What happens when we treat the Quran like a detective treats a piece of evidence? When we apply the tools of textual forensics, the same kind of analysis used on ancient Greek or Roman texts, what story does the book itself actually tell us?
Okay, so where do we even begin? Well, the first place to look is right inside the book itself. The analysis we're digging into suggests the verses of the Quran have these little internal clues, you could call them literary fingerprints, that give us a peek into how it was all put together.
You know, one of the first things that jumps out at you is this massive shift in style. The early verses from Mecca are often in this style called saj. It's this short, powerful, rhyming prose. But then later on, the verses from Medina switch to nath, which is much longer, more legalistic, and, well, more ordinary. Now, textual scholars say this isn't just a simple evolution. The change is so jarring, it's almost like listening to two completely different authors. The analysis also highlights what appear to be direct contradictions in the text. The classic example is the rule on wine. One verse seems to say it's okay, another warns about praying while drunk, and then a later one forbids it completely. Now, Islamic theology has an explanation for this called abrogation, where later verses cancel out earlier ones. But textual critics wonder if this could also point to different rules from different times being woven into the text. And it's not just about wine. You see a similar kind of tension pop up in the rules of war. On one hand, you have the famous verse, "There is no compulsion in religion," but on the other hand, you have commands to fight those who don't believe. It's exactly these kinds of internal tensions that get textual critics really digging. And then there's the language itself. The Quran is famous for its perfect, beautiful Arabic, but a close linguistic analysis has found over 275 words that aren't originally Arabic at all. They're loanwords, borrowed from languages like Persian, Greek, and Syriac, which was a major language in the region at the time. And this is where it gets really interesting. The very word Quran is likely from the Syriac word kardiana, which means a reading or a lesson. Injil, the word for the gospel, comes straight from the Greek euangelion, and Furqan, often translated as the criterion, is tied to the Aramaic word perkana, meaning salvation. It suggests the text wasn't created in a bubble, but was part of a much bigger conversation happening across the Middle East. The investigation also points to what scholars call historical hiccups and borrowed stories. For instance, crucifixion is mentioned as a punishment, but it really hadn't been widely used for centuries. Mary, the mother of Jesus, is called the sister of Aaron, which seems to mix her up with Miriam from the Old Testament, who lived over 1,000 years earlier. And some major stories, like the one about Dhul-Qarnayn or the sleepers in the cave, have incredibly close parallels to Christian legends that were already circulating at the time. Okay, so everything we've looked at so far has been inside the text itself. The words, the style, the stories. But what about the physical evidence? What happens when we look at the actual ancient manuscripts? Turns out, they have a story to tell too. And this brings us to what might be the biggest piece of physical evidence, a manuscript discovered in Sana'a, Yemen. It's not just any old copy of the Quran. It's a special kind of manuscript called a palimpsest, and it was hiding a pretty big secret. So, you're probably asking, what on earth is a palimpsest? Well, think of it this way. Back in the day, parchment was super expensive, so scribes wouldn't just throw it away. They'd take an old document, scrape the ink off, and write something new right over the top. The amazing thing is, with modern tech like ultraviolet light, we can often read the faint, ghostly text that was erased underneath. It's literally 2 documents for the price of 1. And here's the bombshell finding from the Sana'a manuscript. The text on top, the one you can see with your naked eye, is almost a perfect match for the Quran we have today. But the text underneath, the one that was erased, is different. It has hundreds of variations, the verses are in a different order, and some verses are just plain missing. For these scholars, this is physical proof. An earlier version of the Quran was literally scrubbed out to make way for the official, standardized one. And it's not just ancient parchment. We're now in the age of digital forensics. There's this really cool software called stylometry. It analyzes a text for things like sentence length, word choice, all the little ticks an author has, to create a unique fingerprint. Well, when researchers ran this analysis on the Quran, the software didn't find one single authorial fingerprint. It found somewhere between 6 and 8.
So, to put all these findings into perspective, it's really helpful to do a little side-by-side comparison. Let's look at the textual history of the Quran versus the textual history of the Bible. Now, this isn't about which book is better or right. It's just about understanding that they have very different stories about where they came from.
And when you put them side by side, you see two totally different pictures. The Quran traditionally claims to come from a single divine source. The Bible, on the other hand, is presented as more of a library, with over 40 different authors. The manuscript gap for the Quran is tiny. Some copies are from within 20 years of Muhammad's death, while for the Bible, it's much larger. But here's the kicker, according to this analysis. Both books show clear signs of editing. The difference is, in modern Bibles, those edits are often pointed out in footnotes. In the Quran, the work of those 6 to 8 authors found by the software seems to be hidden, blended into what's presented as a single, unified voice.
So, after looking at the words, the manuscripts, and the software analysis, where does that leave us? What's the big picture? Well, let's look at what the consensus is among the academic, non-religious scholars who study this for a living.
This quote from two really influential historians, Patricia Crone and Michael Cook, sums up a big part of the academic view pretty bluntly. They argue the Quran didn't just appear out of nowhere. Instead, it was more like a cocktail, mixed together from the rich blend of Jewish, Christian, and local Arab ideas that were all swirling around the Near East at the time.
And they're not the only ones. There's a whole range of academic thought here. You have Christoph Luxemburg, who made waves by arguing that some confusing parts of the Quran suddenly make sense if you read them as Christian Syriac hymns. Then there's John Wansbrough, who argued the book wasn't finalized until much later, maybe in the 8th century. And even more mainstream scholars like Angelica Neuwirth now agree that the evidence for multiple voices and reduction layers is pretty much undeniable. So, if you boil it all down, the bottom line from this textual investigation is this. The Quran doesn't look like the work of one person in one specific time. Instead, it shows the fingerprints of multiple human authors and editors working over a period of maybe 100 to 150 years.
And this really leads us to the final and maybe most important question. If a sacred book has a complicated, messy human history, what does that mean for its meaning and its authority for people today? For believers and non-believers alike, understanding where a text comes from can't help but shape what it means. It's a fascinating tension between historical origins and spiritual power, and it's something we all have to think about for ourselves. Thanks for watching.